Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now this is the third video in our series on how to make sense of contemporary art. And let me remind you very briefly of what we've said in the first two videos, and which is that really at the heart of this, in order to make sense of some abstract, conceptual, contemporary art, it's necessary to remember that those works of art often answer, indirectly, questions about art in general. That is basically the form that those objects take can be a response, very often is a response to a conceptual, intellectual, theoretical question in relation to the nature of art itself, its aims, its essence, its universality, and its mode of being, basically, among other things. So one of the things we said, of course, was that representation, remember, is a choice. What you see now was drawn by Pablo Picasso, when he was about 5. And he drew this hen, and you can notice here how each feather is done. You can notice the details of the beak and the claws and everything. And basically here, he paints after nature, as it were, so in an approach that kind of links him back to the past, basically, where a painting would aim at representing what everyone could recognize. Now, it could be, of course, a mythical figure or a biblical one, but equally later on, famous people, famous settings, and the like. So what you can see here, of course, is that Picasso could draw really well. So when you hear people, when they look at a Picasso, say, I could do this, remember, representation is a choice. Now, what you see now is also by Picasso, and this time, well, it's more recognizably, his style, sort of. And here, what is the difference in form? Well, this one is a bit less like a real hen. It's not immediately recognizable as a hen. I mean, it's not that far off, but still. And obviously, Picasso is much less bothered here about having the same amount of details, the same exactitude when it comes to details as in the first one. So you could really easily argue here that of the two, the more Picasso one, as it were, is the more interesting by far. I mean, the first one may be outstanding in terms of drawing skills and draftsmanship, especially at that age, of course. But the second one has life, it lives. The second one is less true to nature, but somehow it also refers to, conjures up something else about chickens and about animals and about life, which goes well beyond just showing feathers and a good beak. So here Picasso also exemplifies the fact that representation is a choice. He can represent chicken, a hen, in many different ways, and the fact that he developed his styles over decades, of course, is a reflection of him making choices in terms of how to represent what he wants to represent. He could draw very well, he could paint like the best of them, but he chose not to. He chose to do something else. And this is why representation is always a choice of the artist. So what we've traced so far in those first two videos then is in terms of, the move from figurative to abstract, for example. We've also briefly dealt with some fundamental questions, again, about representation and meaning and interpretation. And so perhaps in the third video we can briefly sort of summarize other questions and expand on some of them as well, and give some very specific examples of what those fundamental questions about art are and how they can be answered in the form of artistic production. And here we can perhaps start off with reminding ourselves of what Ernst Gombrich, the art historian, once wrote, because it links up, of course, with the first two episodes about this contemporary art business. But Gombrich said, well, the whole story of art is not a story of progress in technical proficiency. It is a story of changing ideas and requirements. And indeed, what we've traced so far is much more how ideas changed, ideas about art, ideas about expression, and not so much how much technique has changed. We still marvel at the technical prowess of the Greeks, when it comes to statues, for example. So it's not really a question of techniques here. It's not that the world has become more technical, more complex. It is that ideas about art, ideas about expression, ideas about the place of the artist also, all those have changed, and artistic productions reflect those changes. So the 20th century then, really accompanying all this, necessarily you could say, it happened in literature as well. It saw an increased theorization, more theories about arts, and that's in music as well, in painting, in literature. I can refer you to a video I made about Prokofiev's diaries, for example, where obviously he thinks about music both in a musical and in a theoretical sense. Wonderful, wonderful series of volumes of journal, really, a diary. And so this move again, this increased theorization of art, more theories to explain, to think, to ask questions, and those really were led to, and were also based on some serious questions. And so basically what we've been saying so far is that some of those questions concerned, theories about form, and content, and techniques. That is, how after centuries of having, for example, paintings be square or rectangular, some of them were round, but typically portraits, and typically again paintings tended to be squares and 2D, that is in 2-dimension, flat of course. Well, what does it have to be like this? That is, when do you break with tradition? And can you, and should you, and does it actually give you anything extra? You can see an example here of a move, certainly, 1940s, 50s, 60s, of trying to move out of the canvas while remaining, of course, tied to the canvas. And it is not simply somebody thinking, well, I'm just going to put some stuff sticking out. It is somebody thinking, okay, or having thought about, well, what is a painting really, and does it need to be what we admire so much in the old painters, for example? Does it have to be in 2D? Does it have to be this shape, that shape, etc.? Michel Pastoureau reminds us somewhere in one of his books, for example, how, in a way, surprising it is that photography, or photos in general, follow the pattern of paintings. That is, they are square or rectangular at most. But you hardly ever see photos in any other shape, really, and you have to ask yourself why we want to represent life in that way. And perhaps there is a direct link here, of course, to having been exposed for centuries to representations of the world in this square or rectangular shape, and it seems that we can't escape that anymore. Now, look at your phone, it's still the same shape, of course. You don't see round phones very much, I don't think. So theories about form, content, and techniques, of course, very much evolved. I'm not even talking about sculpture and material and all those things, but it's exactly the same questions. 20th century, certainly, mid-20th century, so also a lot of new or increased questions in relation to theories about meaning. That is, what does an artistic object mean? And in fact, should it mean something? So it was, of course, across the ages, an aesthetic object, perhaps as a painting, for example, but it was also, as we said in the first video, very often a message carrier. It has a message to carry across, be it for educational purposes, religious purposes, historical purposes, all those reasons, of course, but those paintings had more than a simply aesthetic meaning. Remember, in our first video, we talked about the Greek temples being originally a temple and not necessarily, or certainly not a piece of art as such. And theories about meaning here, you can, for example, if you look at this Dali painting, Salvatore Dali, Dali, as is well known, was strongly influenced by Freud and the surrealist, of course, and the role of dreams and the role of the unconscious in the process of creation. When you play a game like Cadavre Exquis, for example, where everybody adds a line to somebody else's line without knowing what that original line was, you end up with a co-creation. Can you say that there is meaning behind it? Well, if you think, for example, that meaning can originate from your unconscious, then certainly it has meaning. But on the other hand, you believe that art has a meaning which is given by the artist in full consciousness of what they are trying to say, then of course surrealism is not full of meaning. It is full of something else, but what? Here I can resist quoting from Susie Blick, who wrote a very, very good book on Magritte. And she remarked at some stage, because Magritte, as I will say in a second, was very much against interpretation and trying to find meaning in his works. And Susie Blick says, if we look at a thing with the intention of discovering what it means, we end up no longer seeing the thing itself, but thinking of the question that has been raised. And I think it's a great point here, certainly when you're thinking about later on conceptual art, for example, art that has as a mission, as it were, to ask questions or to comment on the state of things. Then it may be that it is, in fact, very often the case that we so much focus on trying to find the meaning of the thing that we forget to look at the thing itself. And this is really important as well. There are legitimate questions about meaning in art, and should art mean anything. There's this great philosopher of music, whose name of course escapes me now, but I have all his books and I'm sure it's on screen right now, who makes, of course, who has that ongoing discussion throughout his work on the meaning, the semantic meaning, as it were, of classical music. Does classical music, music without words, not operas, but just instrumental music, does it have a meaning? And you have, I'm sure, heard countless people talk about Mozart, of Bach, of Beethoven, and say, well, when I listen to that piece, I see what he means. He means this, or he's talking about that. And this philosopher of music, whom I love to bits, but whose name I've now forgotten, of course, is dead against the idea that classical instrumental music has a meaning. It has no semantic meaning. It may have an emotional one, but that's something very, very different. This is a controversial issue. Some people do argue that there is meaning in instrumental music. And so you can see that the same question around the arts in general, should it have an additional meaning beyond, again, being what it is? That is strongly related, obviously, to theories about use and functions. That is basically why the arts, and why do we have them? What do they do? What are they about? And perhaps what should it do? Now, does it express emotions? That's what a lot of people say. It expresses emotions. Or does it create emotions? Or is art supposed to make you think? Or is art there to entertain, to appease, to elevate the soul, as some famous 19th century literary critics argued? Is it made to educate? Of course, if you think about the development of a literary movement like the Angry Young Men, for example, in England, around the Second World War, a little bit later, of course, Alan Sillitoe and people like this, then very obviously, and they're not the only ones, of course, literature has a use and a function. It is to represent, for example, those who are never represented. It can, Bertrand Russell would have argued that it was for education of the masses, for example. So here I quote Margaret Atwood from a little book of interviews that was published decades ago. It's called Conversations. And she says, "I don't think poetry expresses emotion. it evokes emotion from the reader, and that's a very different thing. And I think that's a great line, again, questioning what is art for? Is it to express the emotions of the creator, as we've been used to hearing, certainly since the Romantics? Or is it quite simply a way to evoke emotion from the one engaging with the work? And that is a very different thing. It is also a freeing idea, as is well known in literature. If you consider that the author is dead, meaning, of course, that the author has no hold on the meaning and the interpretation of their work, then it means, of course, that it is entirely in the hands of the one who watches, who reads, who listens, to have those emotions arise as a result of the work, and not expect the work itself to contain those emotions. That is a very different thing. The Magritte quote that I was referring to here earlier is Magritte said in an interview, and I quote, "To equate my paintings with symbolism, conscious or otherwise, is to ignore its true nature. People are quite willing to use objects without looking for symbolic intention in them, but when they look at paintings, they can't find any use for them. So they hunt around for a meaning, because they don't understand that what they're supposed to think when they confront the painting. By asking, what does it mean? Those people express a wish that everything be understandable. But the images must be seen as they are. The mind loves the unknown. It loves images whose meaning is unknown. I do not paint ideas, I describe the coming together of objects." Now, of course, we don't necessarily need to take Magritte at face value here, and certainly when you look at many of his paintings, it's hard to ignore the fact that he's not simply describing the coming together of objects. He's carefully choosing those objects to interact in a way that interrogates, again, the nature of reality, the nature of representation, the nature of expectations, and as we saw in the last video, of course, the nature of language itself, and how we fill in blanks on a canvas, for example, or, of course, in a book. And so that links up to new theories, more theories, again, about the art's relationship with reality. And we saw that very clearly in the first video on this subject. Should art, does art, is art's nature an imitation of reality? Should it imitate what is, what seems to be, or should it transcend reality, of course? Here you can see very clearly the sort of evolution. We started off in some ways with Impressionists, the Impressionists, kind of, towards the end of the 19th century. The Impressionists, of course, as the name indicates, were there to create, perhaps in the words of Margaret Atwood, to evoke impressions, not simply to render them. And of course, at the time, modern art developed Fauvism, abstract realism a few decades later. And now you have things like hyperrealism. And this is not a photograph, this is a painting. And it's a school of painting as well. And it is an interesting idea here when you consider what we were saying, quoting Barthes on photography, and Van Gogh remarks on the need for painting perhaps to reinvent itself once photography has firmly established itself. Now people paint after nature in a way almost truer than nature. That is, now one can draw in a way that is very photographic. And then the question becomes, well, what is more artistic in many ways? And should there be here more to admire than draftsmanship and care given to details? And here again, it goes back to the questions that we asked right at the beginning, comparing the Manet painting with the Stubbs painting. We could admire the horses in a Stubbs painting, but it was more difficult to admire their lifelessness in some ways. And you can ask the same question of paintings like this one. And of course, theories about art's relationship with reality meant that all this was based on really theories about what art is. quite simply, that is, it's a very stupid question in some ways, because you think, yeah, I know what it is. I go to the Louvre in Paris, or I go to the National Gallery in London, and I see art. It is indisputable. There's some Van Gogh here, or some Rembrandt there, or whatever. This is art. I know what art is. Well, yeah, but you don't, in a way, because that is the whole point of this series. We look around us and we see objects, installations, stuff, and we're thinking, well, some people say this is art, and I don't see it like this. I don't understand why it should be art. So questions about art, what it is, of course, didn't start in the 20th century, but certainly a great name there is Duchamp. When you see Duchamp here, is basically saying, okay, if I take an everyday object and I put it in a place that says, this is art, like a museum, does it become art automatically? Well, yeah, it does, and that's the thing as well, of course, right? So when Duchamp makes a very pun in French on the Mona Lisa, a production of the Mona Lisa, he's basically using a staple of Western culture, an idolized painting, repurposing it, and he's saying, now if I put this in a gallery, this becomes art. And it's a profound, I know it may not look like it, but it's a profound question about, well, how do we evaluate what is art? How do we know what is art? Is this just the beautiful? This is also, you should probably be reminded of this, I'm sure you've heard of this. Walter Benjamin, of course, published in 1930 something, in the 1930s, I think, a famous essay called "The Work of Art," in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and asking a very real question, which is, well, the moment the work of art is sort of inscribed in a world that can reproduce things ad infinitum, what makes art? What makes art special? And so all those installations, all those objects that don't look like art, you can ask a question, well, isn't it actually a response to those questions, which is, well, isn't art defined by where it is shown? Isn't art defined by who owns it? Isn't art defined by who can buy it? It's a legitimate question again, because you and I cannot buy a Van Gogh, but some people could, can, may. And so does that mean that real art is only in the hands of the few? It doesn't belong to, that it can only be bought for a lot of money? Cannot art be free? Banksy, of course, is certainly answering that question. Banksy is beyond the political messages or the drawing, or not the drawing, but you know what I mean. Just forget any other consideration. Ask yourself, what does it mean theoretically, conceptually, to tag things on walls that are then exposed in galleries and museums around the world? I live in Amsterdam in the Netherlands, and there is a Banksy museum here, well, a wing of a museum dedicated to Banksy. Those things were not intended to be put in a museum, as is well known, of course. So this is Banksy is also, of course, answering those questions about what is art and who does it belong to, and who decides what is art, basically. And all those questions can be then answered in many different ways. Is it possible to identify art? Duchamp, for example, Banksy, if you want to. Is it in fact possible to separate what is art and what is not art? How is that to do this? Is art cultural, historical, punctual, contextual, or is it universal perhaps? Of course, we've talked about that already. Philosophy addressed aesthetics, at least since Aristotle, of course, about, with many theories about why this would be art and that is not art. So symmetry, use of color, formal aspects, subjects. But now the real question is, well, we can see that today the art that sells for a lot of money is not necessarily 16th, 17th or 18th century art, 19th century art. It is a lot of Jeff Koons-like sculptures, excepting some old masters, of course. And so the question really is, well, who decides now who the new Rembrandt is, basically, and how do you know? And of course, it hasn't escaped you that in a full-blown capitalist age, as it were, one thing rules above all else, really, and that is money. To open an art gallery, to have stuff hanging there, to sell them to people who collect those works, is now sort of the way, really, to define what art is. Art is what is in a gallery and what somebody with loads of money will buy, either to put in a vault somewhere or to expose in their house or whatever. It is also, of course, a way to gain cultural capital, that very obviously. But nevertheless, the question is, who creates the value of art? Necessarily, it is those people who decide what art is, and necessarily it's the people who have the money to decide what art is. We're almost reminded, certainly, of Foucault on what it is to be crazy, and who decides who is crazy? Well, the people who actually treat those who are crazy, and so there's a sort of weird absence of definition there, and that might be the answer to how to know what art is today. Well, art is where it hangs, and where it hangs is people with loads of money have decided that this should hang there. It's heartbreaking in many ways, but it's also a real question, of course. Michelangelo was chosen to paint the Chapelle Sixtine because he was, of course, very famous at the time, but surely that turned him even more into art. So, you know, his fame partially to be explained from the works he was given, and therefore the exposure he was given. I'm not saying, of course, that he doesn't deserve it, but it's a legitimate question, certainly when applied to contemporary art. And of course, all this has to be linked to theories about appearance in general and you know, cultural significance. So, can everything and anything be art? I'm certainly thinking about Milan Kundera, wonderful little book on the novel, I think it's called. Great little book. Where he talks about kitsch, you know, and discussing it's a real serious question, certainly in postmodernism, is irony, is kitsch, which is an ironic comment, can it be elevated to the level of art? So can something which implicitly says I am the opposite of art become art? Highly recommended, wonderful little book. Here you can think about, again, somebody like Jeff Koons, for example. His work goes for a lot of money, and you look at those sculptures, and for a lot of people, it's a real question whether art is contained in the work or art is contained in the fame that accompanies the work or that, you know, underpins the work. Same criticism, of course, was leveled at people like Damien Hirst, or these Japanese artists. And here again in Amsterdam we have such a museum with NFTs, for example, that is non-fungible tokens, that is digital art. NFTs were a big craze like 5-6 years ago. They've now lost all values. They still hang in the museum, so does that make them art? And when this museum in Amsterdam decides, if they do one day, to get rid of those digital creations, will they then lose all pretension to being art? We all know this, of course, because we all know about Andy Warhol, and so mixing, you know, celebrity, exclusivity, and echoing Benjamin, I guess, reproduction as well. So the real question when you look at paintings like these ones, or collage by Warhol here, really the question is, well, what is art? If I reproduce something in slightly different colors, it's my creation. I use celebrity, I don't use an everyday subject, and yet I turn that celebrity into something else. Well, here you go, that's art. Of course, some people hate pop art and Warhol type of creations, but the Campbell Soup one is also a question about the nature of art. It's a continuation of the question Duchamp was asking in 1910 or 1912 or whatever. Can anything be art? Can anything be turned into art? Of course. And I know that one question for a lot of people here is the degree of personal creation as opposed to, you know, again, a Manet or Pissarro like this one, Or say a very personal way of drawing like Wyndham Lewis. What is the degree of personal creation? What is the degree of playing with? And you will, of course, know that the same debate is playing out today with AI, for example, and music. So all those things mean that when you look at conceptual art, contemporary art, modern art, really, it means that all those questions are always there somewhere under the surface. And of course questions about the artists themselves, the social standing of them, again their educational role or not, propagandist role. We just have to think about Russian art, for example, around the time of Malinowski, that's what he was, Malinowski. Okay, I've lost the name again, and that's why, of course, famously he committed suicide afterwards. We can think about Soviet art in those days. We can think about a lot of Louis XIV, for example, at the end of the 17th century, created a committee made up of artists and money men, etc., theater people, singing people, opera people, painters. And the sole purpose of that committee was to boost his image and his popularity in France and abroad by representing him and his actions and his country in such and such positive way. This is nothing new in that sense. Propaganda has been around for a very long time. But of course questions were asked, from the Romantics on, maybe an artist is just a conduit. An artist is just the intercessor between the muses and you and me. The Romantics, kind of presented a bit that idea, the idea of the muse, the inspiration, the genius. But as we just talked about, the Surrealist, or Dali, also saw themselves as some sort of almost mechanical conduit of their unconscious. So that begs the question that we've already talked about, which is that are the choices made by the artist more important than what you expect, what you want, what you already know? That's a big bone of contention. Lots of people look at conceptual or contemporary art and say, well, it's not for me because I don't recognize it, I don't get it. Well, perhaps it's because what you want to see in a painting is your own emotions or whatever, or yourself. And as Margaret Atwood again tells you, she creates, they create, so that it evokes emotion. But don't try to look for the emotions of the artist or the creator. This is the wrong approach, as it is, of course, the wrong approach when you read a novel. And that means also that legitimate questions can be asked about whether artists should engage with the world, with the political world or not. And how do you judge what they create? Which criteria can be applied if a poor work of art is actually a wonderful piece of rhetoric about peace? Is that good art? Is a good message enough to make something, the carrying of the message, art? That's very, very difficult, of course, and very thorny question. The moral argument, it's poorly written, but the message is great. Yeah, but does that make it art then? Shouldn't the form be good as the content, of course? So finally, I'll leave you with a few questions that you amuse yourself whenever you're watching this, of course. Some questions you can always ask yourself, which are really difficult to answer like this, very difficult in fact, and again, I remind you that this is what we've been talking about for the last 3 videos. It is to answer or to have an idea about those questions. One question, very stupidly perhaps, is what is bad art? We talk about art, this is good art, this is great art. Is there bad art? And then how can bad art still be art? What would make it art? It's a thorny question. Of course, a question we've already answered in many ways is art the beautiful? Should art be beautiful? Beautiful to look at, nice to look at. Should it be true to nature? That's one thing, but should it be beautiful? Well, why? Actually, can an ugly subject make great art? Now, Rembrandt, of course, answered that question, but it's a legitimate question again, as we'll talk about when we talk about literature in that context. Literature found it very, very difficult for many, many, many decades to address ugly subjects or ugly characters. Now, can an ugly subject make great art? Can art be ugly? Can great art be ugly? If you look at this Bacon, very famous Pope painting, of course, I don't find it beautiful, but I find it like powerful, strong. Now, it's not it's purely subjective response, of course, but I don't think it is beautiful in a conventional sense. So that links up, of course, to another of those questions. Should art have a moral message, or no? Should it be just itself? Again, art for art's sake, perhaps. Or should it have a practical function? After all, why not? Temples, Sixtine Chapel, why not? But as we just saw, one question is, does art have a function in the first place? Why is it there? I know there are ethnographic and sociological theories, of course, about the use of art. But we're past the cave age, so we may have inherited some of this, but we are now, as we've seen, we've been theorizing about this for many, many years. So does art have a function beyond those, for example, religious reasons? Is art meaning? Or is meaning the meaning of art? That is, does art really get meaning in being meaningful? Again, it's a legitimate question. If I paint very well, but sort of blandly, whatever that means, and I'm never recognized as a great painter, people say, well, you draw really well, but yeah, I don't know. But isn't that enough to do it really well? Shouldn't that be art in itself? Or is it just technical skills? And that's, again, very, very profound question. Because it might be that the enjoyment of art is the meaning of art. Just enjoy it. Just like don't think about anything. Just look at it. It's beautiful. Be happy. But then I'm thinking immediately of how so many great works of art make us uncomfortable on some level. And that's, of course, the beautiful distinction in Barthes' Camera Oscura. It's a wrong title. His wonderful book on photography I've already referred to, when he compares the punctum to another term I've now forgotten, of course, but the punctum is when it takes you in the guts, and you don't know, you're looking at the photography, he's talking about photography, and he says it gets you in the guts, and you don't really know why. It's just like this, this sensation, this thing. That is not explainable in some ways, or if it is explainable, then perhaps it's just really boring. So perhaps that's punctum is the whole point of art. It might be. We might as well finish on that note, actually, that this wonderful Barthes approach to photography, distinguishing between a perfect object and the one that creates this gut thing in you that you cannot quite explain, but you know that it does something to you, while you can look at perfection and not be touched by it at all, of course. So I hope you enjoyed those videos. If you've not watched the first two, you might as well, because we're having great fun there as well. Naturally, if you like this, any part of this, please comment, tell me what you think, tell me how you see all those things, what you make of contemporary art. Like, of course, and subscribe. Thank you very much. And until next time, thank you. Bye-bye.